While DMC may be Capcom's more well-known outsourcing project, it wasn't their first, nor was it as poorly received as Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. About 7 months before the release of Resident Evil 6, the Canadian-based Slant 6 Games dared to innovate by turning the franchise into a straight-up third-person shooter, paired with the ever-popular cover system. And just like any uninspired take on a classic franchise, it's as bad as you'd expect. Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City tells a what-if kind of story, presenting a different point of view and an alternate timeline from the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3. The main characters are part of an elite Umbrella cleanup squad who are tasked with retrieving the G-Virus from William Birkin before he can sell it on the black market. Most fans should be familiar with the rest. Birkin injects himself with the G-Virus and goes on a rampage, while rodents spread the remains of the virus above ground. Raccoon City spirals into chaos as zombies are everywhere now, and it's up to the surviving Umbrella Squad to eliminate any traces of the corporation's involvement in the zombie outbreak. This ranges from burning sensitive documents to assassinating survivors who might know too much, all while fending off zombies, monsters, and the United States military forces. The plot is kind of a hit and miss. I do love the concept, and it's essentially a fan service feast. Watching as the opening to Resident Evil 2 plays out, but from a different perspective, is awesome, and it's a nice change of pace to see all of this play out from the bad guy's point of view.
I'm not one of those things! Stop shooting!
That said, there's not much else here. None of the original characters are that interesting, and the game instead relies on moments with already established characters to draw any excitement. So when there's nothing familiar going on, it starts to drag pretty badly.
There he is.
So, you finally come.
Doctor, we're here to collect the G-Virus sample.
The gameplay is where things really take a turn for the worst. Operation Raccoon City is a cover shooter at its core, similar to Uncharted in that sense, and I've already made it clear how little a fan I am of that franchise. Thankfully, there is more variety in the enemy types here, including Lickers, Hunters, and Crimson Heads, along with run-of-the-mill zombies and soldiers. It's a shame then that these special enemies I mentioned are just predictable walking bullet sponges, while the normal enemies are little else than target practice. The zombies are especially pointless as they just meander around and are totally non-threatening. If you end up bleeding heavily, then a swarm of aggressive zombies will come after you, and the same can be caused to the opposing side. This is a cool mechanic, but it does little to fix the game's foundation. Unlike most cover shooters, to take cover in Operation Raccoon City involves simply walking into a wall, and hopefully it happens automatically. This can cause a mess of problems, such as sticking to a wall when it wasn't intended and having a hard time getting unstuck. Furthermore, the game tends to have a hard time allowing the player to pop out of cover to attack. Sections that should seem obvious to fire from are simply not allowed. Taking cover never feels right, which is a serious problem for a cover-based shooter. It's not great in Resident Evil 6 either, but that game offered so many more combat options to make up for it, while Operation Raccoon City is a cover shooter and nothing else. The mandatory computer-controlled partners only make things worse. They're always getting in the way, to the point where it becomes comical. At least they can be left for dead without severely impacting the game, but the extra firepower that they lend does come in handy, so part of the game does turn into babysitting the faulty AI. Thankfully, online cooperative play is available, so if you can somehow wrangle a few buddies to go through this game together, then you'll have a much better time. But you shouldn't even bother because this game is bad. Something that's kind of odd for a fairly modern third-person shooter is that health doesn't regenerate. Instead, the player is tasked with retrieving green herbs which heal instantly, or first aid sprays which can be carried and used at the player's discretion. I'm surprised that the designers took that route when regenerating health is so much easier to implement, but I'll commend them for balancing the game around that aspect fairly well, and for sticking with tradition. There's also a total of 6 playable characters to choose from, each with their own unique skills and abilities. I always chose Bertha, the team's medic, which offered me stronger healing capabilities and more storage for first aid sprays. This might have made a difference in how smoothly I made it through the game, despite playing on the highest difficulty. So mileage may vary, and you could have an easier or harder time depending on the chosen character. There's also online versus multiplayer, but of course, no one's going to be playing this. The online has to be dead by now, right? To my incredible shock, people are still playing this game. Like a zombie that refuses to stay down, the online multiplayer, at least for the PS3 version, is still pretty active. The first time I played, I thought it had to be a fluke, but I easily got into another series of matches on a separate day. I definitely was not expecting this. Anyway, the multiplayer controls very similarly to the single player, complete with the janky cover system and running around for health items before you die. There's also a zombification mechanic that I haven't yet mentioned. It's in the single player too. It's possible to get infected and have your health slowly drain away, at which point you get a game over. It's basically a poison mechanic. This usually isn't a big deal for the single player since antiviral medication is pretty easy to come by, but multiplayer isn't always as friendly. Over 3 minutes after getting infected and I never found the antivirus, but I always manage to stumble upon it when I don't need it. This can be pretty annoying if you don't have a medic on your team that's leveled up to deal with this, and the same goes for leveling up in general. All of the unlockable guns and abilities are very expensive to purchase and leveling up takes forever, unless you play the single player campaign which just showers you with points. So if you want to unlock enough weapons and abilities for just a couple of characters, you'll need to play through the story mode 2 or 3 times. And this unlocks weapons and abilities for both the single player and the multiplayer mode at the same time. Is it even worth doing all this though? Well, to some people, apparently it is. I can't believe anyone's still playing this, but I don't see the appeal. None of the game modes are all that creative, and the poor controls only make things worse. I didn't necessarily have an awful time with Operation Raccoon City, not like I did with Resident Evil Survivor, but it was hardly a good time either. While the callbacks to Resident Evil 2 and 3 were neat, the overarching story isn't anything special and the gameplay is mediocre at best. It's also not bad enough to the point where you can laugh and poke fun at it. It's just bland. If you want a third-person shooter Resident Evil game, then Resident Evil 6 is a much better one to look into. It has its own problems too, but at least it does enough to stand out on its own, and the controls are well executed, while Operation Raccoon City on the other hand offers some fan service at best, but at worst, it's boring. Thanks for watching my review on Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. If you'd like to be updated on my future videos, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter, or check me out on Discord.